Sup, boys? All right. So, uh, a week ago or so, I put a poll up on LinkedIn asking which dystopian sci-fi future are we closest to. The options were Neuromancer, Terminator, Brave New World, and 1984. Now, I only got a total of 16 votes, so it is what it is. But of those, 63% chose 1984, 6% chose Brave New World, 19% said Terminator, and 13% said Neuromancer. Now, I am of the opinion we're headed towards a combination of those movies, which is why I put those movies on there, and not because there's only a 4 choice limit on LinkedIn. That would be crazy. But no, 1984 won with 63% of the vote, as you can see here. So, there we go. So, again, Neuromancer came in third place. Brave New World came in last place, which is interesting. And Terminator came in third place, or second place. So, there we go. These are what we're doing. This is the way of the future, 1984. I am of the opinion that of the dystopian futures, this is the one we're closest to. But it's more like this mixed with this, with a splash of this, and AI isn't really advanced enough to bring us into this one. So, that's where we are. But today, we're going to be reacting to a video about, dystopian, and how dystopian our society actually is. What does this have to do with customer experience? Shut up. All right. We're going to watch this. Are we already living in the dystopia? Let's find out.
From the time machine to 1984, all the way to the Hunger Games, dystopias have only gotten better over time. This could be because...
We're going to try that again.
From the time machine to 1984, all the way to the Hunger Games, dystopias have only gotten more popular over time. This could be because the stories they tell and the worlds they explore seem increasingly similar to our own. Looking at all the seemingly unsolvable issues within our own society leads us to that very question. Are we today also living in a dystopia? Well, to understand whether our world qualifies as one, we really need to just figure out what a dystopia actually is, and what sets dystopian media apart from other genres. At the most basic level, it can be understood as the mirror image of a utopia. While a utopian society is either close or has already attained perfection, a dystopia is the opposite. It's a world where negative aspects of society or massive looming problems dominate everything else. It could be nearly anything, from out-of-control technology to an oppressive regime, or even the consequences of some cataclysmic world-changing event. As long as you've got that, the only restriction is that society still needs to exist. While it wouldn't be very nice to live in a world where the zombie apocalypse has taken place, if wider society has already broken down, then it wouldn't be dystopia. So this is the nuts and bolts of the genre, but it still doesn't really tell us anything about why people like the genre or how much a dystopia resembles our own world. One lucky byproduct of how messed up the world has become is that we've got plenty of material here to help us along. When the world shut down in early 2020, it was pretty easy to see why people thought we were living in a dystopia. Between the empty streets and the 24/7 news coverage, it was almost impossible to go through your day without being confronted by it all. It wasn't surprising that in the first 2 months of the outbreak, the game Plague Inc. saw its global downloads more than double, pushing it towards the top of the App Store charts. Its gameplay of managing the spread of a pathogen was all the more relevant. The film Contagion, which depicts an imaginary flu pandemic, also saw a massive burst of interest. It went from being the 270th most popular movie straight into the iTunes top 10 for digital downloads. These jumps in popularity were pretty predictable, really, in the same way that any movie which seems to predict the future will see renewed interest. If audiophobic aliens really did invade, then A Quiet Place would probably see a meaty bump in sales, at least among people who don't mind reading subtitles. But while Contagion and Plague Inc. aren't really dystopias either, it does illustrate the key behind what's made the genre what it is today. Dystopias are based on taking a problem with our own world and magnifying it until it dominates and defies everything. If you're a writer or any kind of artist, there's clearly more value in doing this with negative aspects of society compared to the good parts.
It's a lot easier.
Be boring to read or watch a film about a true utopia, as there isn't really any conflict or stakes when the problems have already been solved. But dystopian media, on the other hand, can tell us something about our own world. By magnifying a real problem through the lens of fiction, we get a different, more detailed look at it than we could get on our own. By making the problem define the entire story, it lets us focus completely on it. In our own lives, there's too many other things that get in the way, and it's in this way that dystopian media helps us take control over these daunting, practically unsolvable problems that we're faced with today. While there isn't much surviving philosophy on how to make a dystopia, there's plenty of philosophers who try to do the opposite and figure out what makes a perfect society. Some of them never really saw their plans put into action. Plato's idea of an idealized society involved a strict caste system ruled over by mathematician philosopher kings. But as far as we know, nobody ever really tried this. Other ideas were more successful. Confucius and his ideas about society laid the bedrock for over 2,000 years of Chinese history. By far the most impactful utopian philosophy of recent history began with Hegel, a 19th century German philosopher. He saw history as a slow, inevitable march towards an enlightened, free society. In his view, everything was leading up to that utopian point, and it's
Centralization of power, check. Manufactured terrorist threat, check. Antithesis, repressive police state, check. Removal of freedoms, transfer of power from the many to the few. What is this, the Patriot Act?
It's an essential part of his theory of dialectics. But while we might not have reached that point yet, we have seen one of his students' theories put into practice. Marx took Hegel's ideas and applied them to a struggle between the workers and an oppressive ruling class. Over history, this
Everyone's forgotten who runs this valley.
The epic return of Yellowstone, premiering tonight at 8, only on Paramount Network.
If you wait until your headlights burn out, you can lose up to 50 feet of visibility. Switch to Sylvania today. See better tonight.
Tunnel struggle played out time and time again, inevitably leading to a communist utopia after the workers finally triumphed. But unfortunately, this never really happened either. In fact, when communists got into power, it led to some of the most dystopian and oppressive societies ever. Whether it's
Very true. Which, can you blame Marx for that? No. Right? Because you can't. He's not the one that did it. He's just the one that wrote the book. Like, you can't blame Orwell for the surveillance state that a lot of countries have now. I mean, even though he wrote about it, right? You can't blame the author for how people interpret their stuff. And if they put it into action in real life, that's crazy. Unless you want to do it with my books, that's only going to make your customer experience that much better, right?
it's a fault with people or it's a fault with communism itself doesn't really matter for our purposes. The fact remains that these utopian ideas enabled one of the most oppressive dystopian regimes in history. The Soviet Union even directly inspired one of the dystopias we'll talk about later. But it's clear that utopian thinking and the lengths people go to achieve it can easily lead to a dystopian society instead. Once the ends justify the means, any amount of suffering becomes excusable to reach the end goal. There are some theories that don't directly describe how to create a dystopia, but they do predict that the slide into a dystopian society is inevitable.
It probably is.
One of my favorite TV shows is Mr. Robot, and you can probably tell by the amount of times we use the clips in the show. But did you ever see the mail service they use in the show? Well, they're actually today's sponsor, Proton VPN. The VPN that is taking over the world with its massive global network. Proton VPN offers a vast server network of 8,600 servers in over 110 countries, with high-speed connections up to 10 gigabytes per second using VPN Accelerator. And with over 100 million users, they've been featured in the New York Times and Time magazine because Proton VPN stands out. They operate out of Switzerland, which is protected by strong privacy laws. Proton's journey began with Proton Mail, their encrypted email service, but now they offer a
I used to have a Proton email address. Probably still do, but I used to too.
complete privacy ecosystem: Proton VPN, Proton Drive for secure file storage, and Proton Pass for encrypted password management. So why should you use Proton VPN? Well, because they hide your IP address, letting you browse privately and access content from around the world. From streaming, you can watch shows and sports from anywhere by changing your IP location. If you're a gamer, you can benefit from accessing cloud services and avoiding throttling. And even if you're not a gamer, using Proton VPN protects your online activities and access social networks securely. And with their P2P file sharing, you're safeguarded from malware and restricted sites, and Netshield blocks ads and trackers for a better browsing experience. And on top of that, they're also dedicated to privacy with a strict no logs policy, independently verified by auditors, and open source code for complete transparency, allowing you to enjoy secure access to content including Netflix and torrenting, Proton's trusted reputation and accessible plans, starting at just $3.99. So try Proton VPN today by using the link in the description below to learn more and safeguard your online freedom with Proton. The general idea these theories share is that something about technology and scientific progression leads to a dystopia. Either we're guaranteed to abuse the tools it gives us, making the world worse, or the technology changes society itself and creates the conditions that lead to a dystopia. Ted Kaczynski, otherwise known as the Unabomber, was just one of the people who believed in these ideas.
If you've never read his manifesto, you should. I mean, good luck not getting on a list, right? If you order it or if you rent or borrow it from a library or whatever, but it's definitely worth reading. Now, is bombing people and sending bombs in the mail ever okay? No. Did he spell out some really real things in it? Yes. Should you be like the Unabomber? No. Can you agree with some of what he says? Yes.
Now, he had some insane thoughts on how to try and change things, and seemed delusional that he could even affect things in any way. But the basic ideas in his manifesto are lucid, and it was even used as evidence that he was very capable of knowing his actions were wrong, as it was a very well written manifesto with many interesting thoughts. You see, he thought that industrial society and technology was slowly stripping people of their natural freedom, whilst destroying the natural world in the process. The outward benefits of technology are enough to convince people to just let this happen, but he ignores just how much of an impact modern technology has in making people's lives better in general.
Imagine life without a smartphone. Imagine life without one of these. Could you do it? Could you? How long could you last without your smartphone?
For starters, lots of the people watching this today would be dead if not for modern medicine. Modern agriculture means that most people don't have to slave away in the fields, and bad weather doesn't generally lead to mass famine anymore. There's even the fact that as a country becomes more industrialized and more developed, it also becomes more likely that it's a democracy rather than a dictatorship. In nearly every metric, it does seem like technology has made the world better for most people, at least so far. The past 20 years or so have started to bring some very big doubts into people's minds. When new technologies get developed today, it often seems like the negatives massively outweigh the benefits. The internet and instant global communication has led to social media and all the damage that's done to society as well. It also pushed mass surveillance and data.
Excuse me, where is your hot sauce bar?
We don't have one.
Okay. Firehouse Subs has one.
Harvesting into overdrive. AI promises to be the next big thing, but some of its most popular uses include role-playing with a fake girlfriend or replacing the...
That's creepy. That is creepy.
Earth's need for humans in the first place. It all gives the impression that at some point in the past few decades, technology became more destructive than constructive for society. And if this trend does exist and it does continue into the future, it will lead to a dystopian society if it hasn't already. With all of that said, we can get down to the specifics. The question of whether our world is a dystopia might be best answered by people's personal experiences. If the world's problems are preventing someone from having a good and meaningful life, then for all intents and purposes, they're living in a dystopia. But what are those specific problems? Well, let's go through these problems and look at the dystopian media that analyzes them. While it's definitely outshined by other big problems with society, population collapse is a growing concern for nearly all of the world. The media doesn't really focus on it because it doesn't bring in any ratings. It's a gradual problem of statistics and trend lines. But when you examine it more closely, it could shake the very foundations on which our society is built. Modern economies are dependent on growth. If a country's economy stops growing for just a few months, it slips into recession and millions of people see the standard of living drop, often for years afterwards. Part of this assumption that the economy will just keep growing is built onto the idea that there will always be more people to fill all of the jobs that society needs. Population collapse throws a spanner in the works. As it stands today, large parts of the working population in nearly all developed countries are set to enter retirement over the next few decades, but there's far fewer people being born or entering the workplace to fill this gap. It means that the world is already dealing with a large dependent population compared to a small proportion of working.
It's not a good thing. This right here, we were so afraid of population growth, the population explosion, that and for other reasons, that people stopped having so many kids, right? That and people can't afford to have children anymore, even though they could, right? It's all about prioritizing. But we don't have enough children being born now to take care of us when we're older and to keep the economy going, right? So this is a first world problem, but it's also a global issue, right? So because of reasons that I don't want to get into here.
Economically productive people. It's not the kind of problem that seems like it would create a dystopia all on its own, unless you dial this up to 11. That's the scenario that the 2006 film Children of Men explores. The film is set in an alternate future where nobody has been able to have children for 2 decades, pushing society to the edge. Developing countries have almost entirely collapsed without a working population to keep them sustained. Richer, developed countries are a bit better off, but the massive amounts of refugees combined with the economic hardship have pushed them deep into authoritarianism. The film revolves around an apathetic civil servant trying to protect humanity's last chance at a brighter future, the only baby to be born in years. A lot of the movie's strength isn't in the plot though. Instead it's the background information and the details that really tie the film together. There's so much there to make it feel authentic. Some of the details that fans have noticed really show how much thought they put into this. While the film was released years before the Shard was built in London, the film is set in the future so it's visible in the skyline. Then there's the underlying detail that people have become even more obsessed with their pets because they're trying to fill the hole that children left. A lot of the political
Cat moms and dog dads, right?
commentary and the details of the overarching story are left in the background as well. As we mentioned earlier, dystopian media often amplifies and magnifies things going on in our own world, and this is no exception. The two sides of the conflict in Children of Men are both distortions of today's political divide. The rich and powerful are depicted as fascist oppressors, living in their own little bubbles, oblivious to the suffering going on around them. They hoard art from the old world, but it's all meaningless because it's been taken out of the world which gave it context, and soon nobody will be around to appreciate it. They keep this shaky establishment in place with propaganda, brutal reprisals, and oppression. You would expect the film's version of the left to therefore be the good guys, fighting to take down the oppressive system, but instead they're just much more morally grey. One of the first action scenes is later revealed to be an inter-faction assassination plot, for example, and it shows how divided and power-hungry they really are, trying to use humanity's last hope as a political tool. They clearly want to tear down the old order, but that's the only thing they're unified by. At the end of the film, in a big battle scene, they're still just as violent and threatening to the last hope of humanity as the government has been. The whole political conflict running through the movie is framed as the result of hopelessness for the future. But when they see the hope, and they see the baby at the end of the movie, it's one of the most powerful moments in the film. All the conflict and the fighting just stops when they can see that there is still hope. Children of Men does a great job of visualizing our worst fears when it comes to population collapse, but it goes even deeper than that. The film explores the problems with a decaying society. The fact that it's all so intuitive and recognizable shows us a lot about our own world today. The deep resemblance definitely pushes us towards the conclusion that we are in fact living in a dystopia, but it also definitely helps that the movie is trying to imagine what our times would look like. It's a very realistic, close-to-home dystopia set only a few years from the current day. A different test would be to see how our world
A message from the Sonic Department of Research and Delicioussment.
We topped off the new Sonic Smasher you love with our creamy queso with hands
stacks up against a dystopia that seems like it's much more different to our world. One where flying cars, cyborgs, and other futuristic technologies are everywhere. Like the world of Blade Runner 2049, cyberpunk as a genre and Blade Runner in particular focuses on what it means to be human and where we should draw the line between human and machine. In the film, we see a world where every intangible part of humanity has been figured out and replicated, then turned into a product. These human-like machines or replicants are everywhere in the film, and they're treated like a lower class of individual. They're human in pretty much every single way except except for the fact they still can't have children of their own. It's the final barrier yet to be broken down by technology, and Blade Runner 2049's world uses it as justification for their slavery. The story follows Kay, a replicant whose job it is to hunt down other replicants that have gone rogue and rebelled against their programming. In the process, he discovers the body of a replicant who was given birth. It's a discovery that could change the whole society's view on replicants, but as we'll find out, it's also something which could seal the fate of replicants as lower-class citizens forever. Wallace, the de facto corporate overlord of the world and the creator of the replicants, also wants to find the promised child. Replicants are still expensive and slow to create, meaning they still can't fully replace people. If he can unlock that final secret, it'll perfect his product and give him pretty much total control. It's this fact that makes the film feel so close to home, despite all the futuristic technology and skyscraper-sized holograms. It's a world caught in an awkward middle phase, stuck between the past and a utopian future. If non-sentient replicants were perfected and there were enough of them, you could imagine freeing up enough resources for everyone to have a good life. But instead, their scarcity and the tyrannical control of corporations has made the world even more unequal. All the wealth and power is hoarded by the ruling corporate class. The rest of the world is left in an even worse position. We see this in the film when he visits the factory that is all still held up by child labor and oppression. The technology that promised salvation for the masses has instead only deepened those gaps. It mirrors the way that technology seems to be impacting our world today. We're constantly told about how innovations like AI are going to make the economy more productive and therefore make people's lives better. But as we've gotten more advanced, people are increasingly seen as numbers on a spreadsheet. The further we go, the more the world's
This right here is a big issue. When people are viewed as percentages on a balance sheet or what their stats are on a spreadsheet, the worse that they're treated. Because once you allow that thought in, it escalates, right? It becomes, you don't view them as human anymore, even if you pay lip service to the fact that you do. So be careful not to become a spreadsheet manager or view humans as nothing more than assets.
seems to alienate people. Despite massive improvements in productivity and wealth creation, tons of people are just poorer and have less opportunities than they had 10 or even 50 years ago. The world of Blade Runner 2049 has gone further on this path than ours has. Corporations are publicly in full control of every branch of the government, for example, rather than just pulling the strings from the background. But the fact that we're even on this path to begin with betrays a dystopian quality about our modern world, and how it doesn't seem like it's designed for people anymore. This is just one small part of the themes explored by Blade Runner 2049, of course. To get a more detailed breakdown, check out our full video on the movie. We've seen two dystopian societies so far that have turned into dystopias by outside forces. Either the progression and misuse of technology in the case of Blade Runner, or a global fertility crisis in Children of Men. But these aren't necessary. All you need for a dystopia is a society that's reliant or even designed to create its own misery. Enter 1984, the essential and possibly the most oppressive dystopian society ever imagined. There's a reason that 1984 has had such a huge impact on culture. It explains the workings of an oppressive society incredibly well. Even decades later, and nothing else gives us the same tools to accurately deconstruct the totalitarianism of our own world, which we've also done a huge video on before. The world of 1984 is defined by stagnation. The ideology of the ruling party and the world they created is expertly designed to suppress and dominate every other part of life. One of the most striking parts of Orwell's dystopia is what the party has done to language. Normal languages like the kind that we use don't exist in a vacuum. Every word or phrase we say only has any meaning based on the context in which it's said. The philosopher Wittgenstein explains this through his theory of language games. Take the word cut, for example. If you read it in a recipe, it's probably referring to something about chopping vegetables, but a director shouting it on a movie set would make the word mean something completely different. All words are like this, they're all dependent on the specific language game that you're playing at the time. They're just building blocks. In 1984 though, even this freedom is in the process of being suppressed. Orwell imagined the party creating a new language called Newspeak, where most of the linking words have been taken out, while other words have been changed or removed entirely. The result is a language which has barely any building blocks and where the context has already been decided. It only works and you can only understand it in the context of submitting to a party rule. Rebellion and disagreement within the party line is therefore impossible to even comprehend when using Newspeak. As we've said before, dystopian media often amplifies things we see in our own world today. And while we haven't created a whole new language yet, we have seen certain words and phrases getting removed from our language completely. And social media is one of the biggest culprits. There's plenty of words which would be more accurate, but we can't actually say them because of YouTube's arbitrary rules. It's all a way to restrict language so that things people...
It's like saying unalived, right? So, yeah.
People talk about fit into the sanitized corporate context which they want to force on people. All the stuff we've been talking about seems to confirm our worst fears, that we are living in a dystopia. The fact that our society embodies so many dystopian qualities seems to confirm this, but it still isn't the full picture. There's still one part of dystopian media that we haven't actually fully discussed, and that's the theme of hope, which is always present in some way or another. Some dystopian stories have a positive ending, which implies that the society moved on from this phase and got better in some way. Children of Men is like that, for example. It's all about the power of hope. Others, like 1984, seem like they end with all hope having been extinguished. The main character of Winston eventually succumbs to indoctrination and loses his humanity. But even in the bleakest dystopia imaginable, that hope still exists somewhere. The parts of life the party is trying to suppress and make people forget will always exist, however well they're hidden. It means that while our world has dystopian qualities and it does seem to be getting worse in lots of ways, we'll never truly live in a real dystopia. The world is just too complex and varied for any one thing or problem to dominate it completely. There's still tons of problems, and for an increasing amount of unlucky people, they come to dominate their individual lives. It doesn't mean that the good parts of life like art, music, hobbies, friends and family aren't there. Our modern world has made it harder and harder to lose yourself in those parts of life. It all gets in the way and we're bombarded with these dystopian problems constantly, and it's made the skill of being able to tune all of that out even more important.
And there we have it. Are we living in a dystopia? Are we headed towards a dystopian society? I don't know. Certain parts, yeah. So, I mean, just read William Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, right? So, Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive, right? We're headed there. So, we're headed towards 1984's rampant censorship, right? Where people are actively speaking against the freedom of speech, which is ironic, right? Who are actively going against the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and want it rewritten, right? So that's kind of scary. So, or people that think that hate speech is illegal in the United States when it's clearly not. It's protected under freedom of speech. And we don't have freedom of speech just to talk about the weather, right? But people want to actively destroy the best, most honest freedom that we have, which is sad. So we're headed into an era where AI is taking over. It's taking jobs. This has already happened. This is not alarmist. It's not controversial. It's happened, right? And it's going to continue to happen. And whereas progress is progress, and we've seen this in the past, right? We don't have ice merchants anymore. We have refrigerators, right? We don't have operators anymore, I think. No, most phone connections are automated. So it is what it is. But that doesn't mean that we have to allow ourselves to succumb to the hopelessness, to totalitarianism. We don't have to succumb to that. We can be free and take care of our fellow humans while making progress. It's not a and or. It's we can make progress and we can exercise personal liberties and we can take care of our fellow humans, which is something that we have to do. We've seen it in the last 4 years, right? Ever since the pandemic, life in the States and life globally has gotten worse. Wages have stagnated, prices keep increasing, and whether that's leftovers from the pandemic or corporations gouging prices or this, that, and the other, right? Not handling the economy correct at the government level, right? Remains to be seen. I don't know. I'm not an economist. All I know is what I see at the grocery store and at the gas pump, right? And while eggs have gone down in the last year and a half from their historic highs of what, $8 a dozen. Now it's 5, which is still a lot. You used to be able to buy eggs for like $2 a dozen, right? Just a few years ago. It is what it is. There was a lot of inflation. There was a lot of price gouging, probably. There was a lot of shortages because of factories suspiciously burning down a few years ago, or a lot of cases of flu or sickness among chickens, right? Or beef processing plants being burned down, stuff like that, right? Which rose prices. It's fine. And people were having to eat a lot of refined carbohydrates, which I'll let you look up that, but it's not the best for human consumption, right? It's not bad for you in any means, but it's not the best, right? So it is what it is. So are we headed towards a dystopian future? Are we in a dystopia right now? Depends on who you are. And that's the thing in dystopian fiction as well, right? It depends on who you are. If you're one of the rich, if you're one of the elite, it ain't that bad. It ain't that different. If you're part of the working poor, or if you're part of the poor that has no work, yeah, it's a dystopia. We even have the escapist garbage and the escapist toys that they have, right? Like, let's take Cyberdecks, right? The VR headsets that a lot of cyberpunk or other sci-fi literature or art have, right, to escape the real world, right? We have that. We have that in the form of smartphones. We have that in the form of, well, literal VR helmets. And we have that in the way of mindless garbage TV. That's pure escapism, right? We have synthetic food. We have things like energy drinks instead of coffee, which is a big thing in a lot of dystopian fiction, where coffee became such a shortage that people are drinking things called like soy calf or new calf or anything like that, and that's a Red Bull. Let's be real here, right? We have these things instead of tobacco, right? Cigars or cigarettes. We have these synthetic tobacco or nicotine things, right? Drug use is going up. The population is going down. And that's the opposite of a lot of dystopian sci-fis, right? Is where there's too many people, we're going through not enough. We are below replacement rate, and that's not good. I know a few years ago everybody was worried about population growth and population overgrowth, but that's reversed itself to an alarming level. People need to have more children. People need to be fruitful and multiply. Or society is going to collapse. We're built on new people coming in who share our values, who share our culture, and or that can share the culture and can share the values. And there's nothing controversial in saying that. We need to do better. And how does this tie into customer experience, which is what this channel is about? There's not enough people coming in, there's not going to be any customers. If people can't afford your products, there's not going to be any customers. There, we tied it all together. So what are your thoughts on this? Are we living in a dystopia? Or are we headed there really fast? Or is everything just wine and roses and everything's okay? I think that will depend on how you view the latest American election. So let me know what you think. Bye.